befriend.
Have you not?
And here we go.
And greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the Ambassadorial Wing. In more than a minute. It's been several thousand, I would wager several million minutes since I've been with you all last. And tonight, we return to the 90s with a little cult classic known as the movie, not the show, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I want to say to all of you, I have missed you all very, very much. I'm glad to be back. I'm sorry for the last couple of days with the reschedules and so on. Circumstances beyond my control, one being my health and the other being some technical issues prevented me from doing this stream. And obviously had to do some reworking of it. So tonight we're going to be discussing Buffy the Vampire Slayer, not one. But before we get to the discussion itself, let's get the housekeeping out of the way. Make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you hit this share button. Make sure you share this out with all of your friends who love discussions and channels who discuss film of our childhood, of our teens, of our 20s, and even to our adulthood. I will not lie to you all. I've missed you all very, very much. I'm glad to be back. And tonight, we're coming back on a high note because this is a movie that launched a series that I, and I imagine many more of you, greatly enjoyed. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And a quick disclaimer. Yes, I do acknowledge that bit of a scumbag. Yes, he is not a particularly nice guy. But that does not rectify his that does not change the fact that does not change a show that we all know, that we all love, and that we all enjoy. Because here on the Ambassador Wing, and I imagine amongst many very common sense, level headed people, we can separate the art from the artist. So, with all of that being said, let's get into the discussion. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Now, I will tell you all, wholeheartedly and sincerely, I got in the 1990s. It wasn't particularly on my radar. Not that I don't think I would have not enjoyed this movie when it came out in 1992. I probably would have. But there were other movies that were coming out at the time. I was in junior high, actually, at the time. But for those of you who may not know what junior high is, junior high school or middle school, for those who might be of a later generation, and that's okay. We're all different ages here. And I have to admit, the first time I ever heard the name Christy Swanson was obviously for a movie that came out many years later, a little film called Dude, Where's My Car, where she played the babe amongst babes, Christy Boner. But tonight we're not discussing Dude, Where's My Car. Obviously. This is a movie that does not take itself too seriously, and they're in front of it. It is extremely campy. It is cheesy. It is corny. It is, well, I think that's good enough. Those are good enough descriptors for this movie. It takes the horror genre and turns it on its head because let's be honest here. With a title of a movie, Vampire Slayer, what would you expect? And I think this movie delivers exactly what you would expect. A movie about a cheerleader named Buffy from the Valley in California in the 1990s who finds out that she is, in fact, one of a long lineage of teenage girls who fight and kill vampires. However, the thing that surprised me about this movie is, in fact, the cast. Because this is a cast, obviously, I knew of Chrissy Swanson. I knew of Luke Perry playing Pike, the Buffy's partner in slaying in fact, her first of the many Scoobies that we would come to know as the Scooby Gang in the Buffy the Vampire TV series. But when I went through the IMDb of this movie, and when I watched this movie and the credits rolled by, and I went, Donald Sutherland was in this, Rutger Hauer was in this, David Arquette was in this, even Thomas Jane. I would say probably except for maybe John Bernthal, one of the most notable actors who played Frank Castle, the Punisher, had a cameo in this. I was very, very surprised, particularly with Donald Sutherland and Rutger Hauer. I mean, these guys, granted, they're both now gone, and we said our goodbyes to them and everything over the last few years, sadly. But you have Donald Sutherland playing the Watcher, Merrick. And the interesting thing is, he is not your atypical Watcher like Rupert Giles or Wesley from the TV series. He is, in fact, an immortal. And I found that idea rather intriguing. You have a brief opening and everything. You have a cold open for this movie, or an intro scene discussing the lineage and the history of the Slayers. And of course, you have Donald Sutherland playing a trainer or the Watcher at the beginning. And you have Christy Swanson in a rather garish or very unconvincing wig to cover up her blonde locks, playing the Slayer in the past. And then we see her again later on in another flashback scene playing the Slayer once again. And the thing that one of the things I love about this movie is this is quintessential early 90s. The way of speaking, the vocabulary used, the wardrobe is very, very quintessential 90s. Now, granted, Rutger Hauer's costuming as Lothos, the master vampire, is extremely outlandish. They obviously toned it down for the TV series when it came to villains like the Master or the other vampires, obviously. Oh, and I did not want to fail to mention one other member of the cast in this. We had the one and the only Paul Reubens, aka Pee Wee Herman, for those of you who remember Pee Wee Herman, as a vampire. If you've seen the gif of Buffy killing a vampire and you're like, wait a minute, I feel like I know that guy. That's Paul Reubens. That's Pee Wee Herman. He plays the vampire. I've got the name right here. It's just on the tip of my tongue. Amulin. The vampire Amulin. So, but this movie is, as I said, this was a first time watch for me, and I deeply enjoyed it. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV series. Most of you who follow me on social media know this. I have the box sets of both Buffy and Angel. I have a couple of the Funko Pops or anything. Granted, I don't have as many as I would like, but I have the important ones. I have Buffy and Giles, and I am happy. But like I said, the way of speaking, the wardrobe, it all screams of early 1990s. And that you have this somewhat empty-headed cheerleader who is in fact a Vampire Slayer, a girl who goes around killing the undead. I mean, most of the time when we think of vampire hunters or killers, we think of, well, Wesley Snipes' Blade or mm, Anthony Hopkins as Abraham Van Helsing from Bram Stoker's Dracula, or any other, well, Vampire Hunter D from the anime series, or Trevor Belmont from the Castlevania anime, or the list goes on and on. You don't think of some blonde-headed, somewhat bubble-headed valley girl as a vampire slayer. It just does not work. But in this movie, this is what we get. And what we get in this movie is a flipping, as I said before, a flipping of the script on what a vampire slayer should look like, or how a vampire slayer should even behave. And it is just absolute unadulterated 90s camp. And I have to say, now that I've seen the movie, I love it almost as much as the TV series that spawned it. This is a this is a rather straightforward movie. You have a cheerleader who finds out that she's a vampire slayer. You have the wise mentor played by Donald Sutherland, and I have to say, Donald Sutherland in this part, I think, went way above and beyond what this part or even this movie deserved, because he really brought some weight and some seriousness and at times even some levity. I mean, this is Donald Sutherland. We know what he's been in. This man has had a career that spanned decades. I mean, the first movie I can recall ever seeing him in was I believe it was a 1960s or a 1970s World War II picture with Clint Eastwood called Kelly's Heroes, where he plays a tank commander called Screwball. And they use their tanks to make art. I mean, he was in the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He was later in a adaptation of Robert Heinlein's uh, the Puppet Masters, which is in fact a sort of a retelling or a different take on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Obviously, he played President Snow in the Hunger Games franchise. And the list goes on. And yet he gives a stellar performance in this movie. He really brings a weight and a seriousness to his role as Merrick. And he has what I would think is a very impactful death scene. Because obviously we know that in the series, Buffy gets a new watcher. Obviously, it's Rupert Giles, played by Anthony Stewart Head, who, well, it's Giles. You gotta love Giles. But I'd say there's a little bit of a downgrade in names because you go from Merrick to Giles. I mean, okay, Merrick has weight. Merrick has oomph behind it. Giles, although his nickname, Ripper, that's got some weight behind it, but I digress. You have Luke Perry, of course, playing the townie, the homeless bum, as they call him, Pike. And this was, I think, right around the time that Beverly Hills 90210 was kicking off, and Luke Perry became a star overnight. Yeah, in this movie, he plays a mechanic, kind of a drifter, a wanderer, in a manner of speaking. And he senses that something is rather sketchy going on in town, and he's like, I'm getting the hell out of here. And on two different occasions, he tries to leave town, and the first time he's in his van, the van breaks down, and he's surrounded by vampires. And you've got Paul Rubens playing Amelin, who jumps on the hood of his van and is trying to snatch Pike. and I think turned him into one of the other legions of undead. And this results in a rather gripping car sequence, or in this case, a van sequence, where they're driving through a grove of trees and Pike's trying not to crash. And Amelin eventually jumps up onto the roof of the van and punches his arm through the roof of said van and is trying to choke or attack Pike. And what ends up happening is Pike deliberately crashes his van into, well, there's actually a low-hanging tree branch. Amelin goes face first into said tree branch and his arm breaks off. And later on, you have a scene between Amelin and Lothos, and Lothos is just absolutely, he's like, you had him. I lost my, and Amelin's like, dude, I lost my freaking arm. He's like, so grow it back. He's like, I wonder how you got through the Crusades, because little dialogue clues to indicate that these guys are centuries old. They've been around since the Crusades and so on. And Rutger Hauer. Rutger Hauer is the baddie in this movie. Now, obviously, he played one of the most notable villains of the 1980s in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, where he played Roy Batty, I believe it is. He gives that very iconic Tears in the Rain speech at the end, just before he dies. But in this, he is just hamming it up. I mean, his performance is so over the top. I mean, this is what you would imagine the campiest of campy vampire movies would be like. I mean, I'm not talking like Christopher Lee Hammer vampire or Dracula type movies. I'm talking like the low budget, which this movie, if I understand correctly, didn't have that big of a budget. Let me take a look here. Hang on. Let's see. Okay. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to note: there are other two relatively well-known, at least not at now in the current era, but not at the time, actors that actually had supporting roles in this, and that is, of course, David Arquette, who we all know as Dewey from the Scream franchise, and Hilary Swank, who was at one time the queen of the Oscars because she kept winning Oscar after Oscar after Oscar until she stopped. I think she did once she did The Core, her career kind of went. But Hilary Swank plays one of Buffy's friends named Kimberly, who is a fellow cheerleader, and she's. I won't lie to you all. I was like, when I was reading the credits, Hilary Swank is in this. Hilary Swank and David Arquette. I was like, no way, absolutely no. And sure enough, and not only that, David Arquette plays one of Pike's best buddies, during the course of the movie, he plays a character named Benny, who he himself gets turned into a vampire. And there's also one other actor I want to mention in this, and this is an actor that I've come to deeply enjoy, and that is Stephen Root. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the name, and that's okay if you're not, Stephen Root he was the high school principal or a school counselor or something along those lines in this movie. He was almost like the proto version of the principal from season 1 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer until Armin Shimmerman took over as Principal Snyder. We all hate him. And I think we all cheered when Snyder got eaten. Very much so. But Stephen Root, one other movie role in particular, that of course being Milton Wadhams from Office Space. But he's more known for a character that he only voiced, and that is, of course, Sergeant Barber Bill Dotree from King of the Hill. And when I saw Stephen Root's name pop up, I was like, okay, we're gonna have some laughs in this because Stephen Root, that man's got great comedic timing. Oh, there's one other movie I almost forgot to mention. He was also in Dodgeball, the flick with Ben Stiller and Vince Vaughn, where he plays one of the members of the Average Joe's dodgeball team. If you want a point of reference, he's the one that got really, really angry and took out one whole team of dodgeballers all by himself. So, and he had a mail order bride. I can't remember the exact ethnicity of the bride, but she wasn't American. Obviously, she was mail order. But the basic premise behind this is a flipping of the script of the classic horror movie trope. You have the weak, innocent, helpless, blonde-headed, or just female character in a horror movie who eventually gets taken out by one of the snarling, slobbering, bloodthirsty creatures of the night. But in this case, it turns out that the weak, helpless girl is actually a unknown badass. And I love how this is revealed throughout the course of the movie because Merrick is kind of watching her from a distance, trying to make sure she is the next Slayer. And then eventually, when she does, I'm trying to remember exactly what she does and everything, but he's like, oh, yeah, okay, you're the one. So you got to be trained. And oh, I remember now. He walks into the girls' locker room there in the gym, and she's like, you're not supposed to be here. This is like a naked area. And he's like, I had to make sure it was you. She's like, make sure I was what? He's like, well, you're the chosen one. And she's like, what the hell does that even mean? I'm the chosen one. Well, you're the vampire slayer. You are the slayer. And she's like, I'm the what? What is your stitch? What's your issue? What's your damage? As we would have said in the 90s. What is your damage? Of course, that still works nowadays as well, especially with certain sections of the population. What's your damage? But I digress. And you have Luke Perry playing Pike, who is he's the mechanic, he's the grease monkey, he's kind of the tough in the town. And he kind of has a heads up ahead of everybody else as to, okay, there's something really sketchy going on around here. And he's like, I'm getting the hell out of here, especially after his best friend is floating outside of his apartment window and is like, hey, dude, let me in. And he's like, you're floating off the ground. And he's like, yeah, so what? Let me in. And he's like, dude, Benny, screw off. And I have to, okay. I will get, as I said before, disclaimer, yada, 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 Joss Whedon, a bad guy, blah, blah, blah. And no, I don't mean to blah, 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 because, yeah, he really is a bad guy. But you see Whedon's abilities as a writer in this movie, and you see the passion that he put into these characters, and obviously what would come after with the TV show itself. Now, the interesting thing is, this movie was released by Universal Studios, which tracks because, well, Universal is known for, the Universal monster movies. Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, yeah, on and on and on and on. So that makes sense that they would finance this, at least in part. But you have also the some of the producers and directors and everything that would go on later to finance and fund the series, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Actually, the director was one of the financiers or producers of the TV series. I'm probably going to butcher her name, but I do apologize if I do. But it's Fran Rubel Kuzi. So, but for those of you who know the production things behind Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Fran Kuzi was actually one of the one of the executive producers, if not one of the producers on Buffy. And the opening sequence of this, we come to they call this the light age instead of the dark age, and they don't spell it Light, they spell it Lite, the light age. Again, this movie does not take itself too seriously, and that's in part that's one of the reasons it's fun. Now, one other thing I want to talk about. Obviously, Buffy was kind of the archetype for the concept of the monster hunter, the monster killer, but in this case, a female version. Because after Buffy, we got Whistler's daughter in Blade Trinity, played by Jessica Biel. We've got obviously Buffy and the Scoobies and everything from the series. We got Selena from the Underworld, played by Kate Beckinsale in the Underworld franchise. And there's been several others as time has gone on. But Buffy really set the benchmark for what a character like this could be. Now, she also harkens back to the 1980s, female of that decade. I mean, obviously, we know who they are. You've got Ripley as you got Sigourney Weaver as Ripley. You've got Princess Leia from Star Wars, and so on. And what Christy Swanson does with this part is you see a definite development of Buffy as a character because she is your atypical who's a cheerleader. She talks the latest lingo, and you see that in also reflected in the pilot episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, played by Sarah Michelle Gellar, when she's talking with Cordelia Chase, or Cordy for short, because we all come to know and love Cordy, even though she is at times kind of a bitch, but she's a lovable bitch, so we give her a pass. Then she had to put up with Xander. Just saying. Any woman who put up with Xander Harris deserves a medal, even though even Xander grew up. And I would even posit the argument or posit the idea that Pike was a proto version of Xander for the movie and going into the series. Although Pike is not as klutzy as Xander was, but still there are connections there. Okay, I can do one better. Pike is the early version of Angel, just minus being a vampire. So he's dark, he's broody, he keeps to himself, he's kind of not like the other guys, obviously. But one of the things I love is the chemistry between Luke Perry and Christy Swanson, between Buffy and Pike. Because as I was saying, Buffy is all about, being being on the dance committee, being part of the cheerleading squad, and just living her life, living her 1990s Valley Girl life, and not having a whole lot going on up in the cerebellum. But as time goes on, she steps into her role as a Slayer. She trains, and from the best that I can gather watching the movie, I think Christy Swanson did a fair bit of her own stunt work. I imagine there was some stuff that she could not do or it was unsafe for her to do. But she delivers those kicks, she delivers those punches, and when she stakes a vampire, she makes it look believable. Now, as far as Buffy's evolution as a character in this movie, and this movie is just a little over or just a little under an hour and a half. It's not a super long movie. What you get with Buffy is, like I said, she's the atypical 90s teenager. who's got a boyfriend, although they seem to be off again, on again and off again. She's head of the cheerleading squad. She's got her group of friends. She's just living her life. She doesn't expect any of this. She doesn't necessarily want any of it, but she realizes that there's very weird and abnormal things going on in town and in the school because kids are starting to go missing. Some of them are turning up as vampires. And she comes to realize, okay, this is getting real. I need to do something about this. So, okay, I'm going to listen to this Merritt guy and I'm going to have him train me. And I will say the training montage or montages that we see she sold it very well. The choreography, very convincing. I will say one thing that kind of lacked a little bit is when Buffy is using Merrick's hands as she's using him as kind of as a punching bag in sorts. It looks like she's holding back, but then again, it is Donald Sutherland. We don't want to hurt the poor guy. Just ease up on the intensity of your punches, Buffy, or in this case, Christy. One of the other things that that I also enjoyed about this movie was the soundtrack because this is a very 90s soundtrack, and there's actually some bands in here that I recognize. And of course, if you don't recognize it, there's something wrong with you. But you've got CC Music Factory, you've got Toad the Wet Sprocket. If you're a 90s kid, you know, you know. You got Ozzy Osbourne, obviously. You got the Divinals. You've got a couple of other smaller known bands. Called The Cult, the other one called Mary's Danish. That's a new one, Mary's Danish, and another one called Dream Warriors. But I have to admit, the soundtrack for this movie, in a lot of ways, quintessential, not in a bad way. Although Ozzy Osbourne is good, even though he's kind of he retired from his music career, and I'd say justifiably so. He made his fortune. He's done his reality TV show, and he's living a quiet life now. And I say to you, Ozzy, rock on, and thank you very much. But this is a deeply enjoyable movie, regardless of the decade you were born in. Now, like I said, most of you know, I'm a Gen X. I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 78. Grew up in the 80s, was a teenager in the 90s. Went to high school in the 90s. How representative is this movie of the world of the 1990s? Very much so. Granted, there's probably a little variation. And thankfully, my memory has not gotten that bad that I cannot remember the 90s. Of course, I didn't do any drugs and I didn't drink in high school either. So I was one of the clean kids. You could say I was a geek. I'm a geek. I'm a geek. But this movie does, I think, in many ways encapsulate what the 1990s, the world of the 1990s was like here in the United States, in America. I would say probably is very representative of the pop culture of the 1990s. Granted, this movie came out in 92, so we were leaving the 80s. There was still some holdover from the 1980s going into the 90s in terms of clothing style, hairstyle, music culture, and so on. The way people talked it did shift from going into the 80s into the 90s, but for the most part, it is I would say, granted, it is a fictionalized world, but it is, I would also say, very representative of the early 1990s. And it's rather ironic. This movie came out in 1992, and I look at how the guys and the girls dressed in high school, and I can look at that and say some of it's a bit exaggerated, but a lot of it is it is accurate. So I will say this: if you were a Gen Xer, or if you were a kid that grew up at the end of the night, or was born at the end of the '90s, and you want a snapshot of what the '90s was like, check out Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You will get a good idea of what probably your older brothers or sisters, your parents, if they were teenagers during those years, or even your aunts and uncles, when they say, well, if you ask them, what were the '90s like? Go watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You'll get a good idea of what the '90s was like, because you also have the mall culture, and I will say the mall scene in this movie where Buffy and the girls go to the mall to do some shopping, do some window shopping, and just figure out. One thing that I love is when they're trying to figure out which movie theater to go to see a movie, and they call out AMC, and she's like, "No, the corn's way stale," and I'm like, "Yeah, I will agree with that." Even nowadays, the popcorn at AMC is rather stale, and it's, well, obviously extremely overpriced. I mean, buy a box of popcorn for like $2 or $3. Well, with inflation, adjust for inflation, relatively speaking. Which you can pop your own popcorn. It's cheaper than going to get popcorn at a movie theater. Although I will say there are some theaters, they do some quality popcorn. I will agree. I will give them that point. I would say more so. Although I cannot remember what movie they went to see off the top of my head. I know it was something that was, I think it was something current, but I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. And that bothers me. But anyway, I digress. You might ask, Ambassador, did teenagers really talk like they talked in this movie back in the '90s? Yes, we did. And I when this movie came out, I was in junior high, as I mentioned before. But yes, people really did talk like this in the '90s. We did sound this odd, this screwball, this, what the hell did they just say? Was that even English? Yes, it really was English. It very much was English. Very broken, very 90-ish English, but it was still, yeah, that's how we talked. And now that I look back at it, I have to think to myself, why did we talk like that? One of the reasons, probably because it annoyed our parents or our grandparents, or annoyed the squares there. Oh, that's okay. The squares that were around us. And you might also ask, Ambassador, were you one of the cool kids, or were you a square? I was somewhere in the middle. I definitely wasn't a square because I got along with everybody, minus the people that wanted to give me grief. But yeah, I did get along with everybody for the most part, because not that I was ever as cool as Ferris Bueller, but to quote the secretary, I got along with the motorheads. I got along with the geeks because I was one. I got along with the wastoids, the dweebies. I was friends with people who smoked weed. I never partook, but I never gave them any hassle, and I sure as hell wasn't going to narc on them, because I was very much one of those, was live and let live. Live your life, let me live mine, and we'll all be cool. That's how it was back in the '90s. We weren't all up in everybody's business. We weren't telling everybody how to speak and how to think and how to feel. Live your life, you live yours, I live mine. We all get along just fine. Before the dark times, before the internet. But I digress. The other thing I want to mention about this movie is it well written. I give, as I said before, I give credit where credit is due. Joss Whedon wrote this movie. He wrote a very good script. The dialogue is, as I've mentioned, quintessential 90s. It's got snark, it's got sass, it's got humor, and it's delivered well. I won't lie to you all. I watch this movie and I miss the 90s. I really do. I know every decade had its problems, had its issues, so on and so forth. I acknowledge that fact. But for me, the 90s was a much simpler time. And this movie is a portrait of that. Not to build it up more than what it is. It's a campy, cheesy parody of the classic horror movie where you have a cheerleader fighting vampires, wearing a prom dress and with a leather jacket on. And fighting the master vampire who has a katana style sword and she's using a a flagpole. But for all of its campiness and goofiness and at times garishness, it's extremely entertaining. Now, is there some obvious stunt replacements, particularly in the fight between Buffy and Lothos at the end? Yes, of course, because Rutger Hauer, he probably didn't know how to safely use a katana style sword, and I wouldn't expect him to do so. So yeah, the wig and the costuming for the stunt double, it's kind of noticeable. But at the same time, if you can suspend your disbelief, it works just fine. No issues, no troubles, no worries. And I haven't said enough about Rucker Hauer's part in this. Now, Grant, he only has maybe like on screen, he has like maybe four or five scenes in total, including the final fight between him and Buffy. But in those scenes, you get an idea of who Lothos is, just how dangerous he is, how powerful he is, and also just how kind of goofy this character is. Because yes, this is the master vampire in this particular context, but this isn't like Deacon Frost in Blade. This isn't like the master vampire in Salem's Lot, if you're familiar with that. This isn't like Count Orlok in Nosferatu. This isn't like either Bela Lugosi or Gary Oldman as Dracula, or even Christopher Lee as Dracula. This is Rutger Hauer as the master vampire, and he plays the part extremely well. This movie has, if you're looking for just a good, fun, watchable action comedy, this is the type of movie you want to. I would even put it in the same category as a spoof. And for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, think of Scary Movie. That's a spoof. For those of you that might be of my generation, think of obviously, any of the Mel Brooks movies from his catalog of films, Blazing Saddles, Baseballs, Young Frankenstein, the Airplane movies with Robert Hayes and Julie Haggerty, and oh, for heaven's sakes, The Lloyd Bridges. If you're old enough to remember those, as if you're as old as me, Buffy the Vampire Slayer fits very nicely into those spoof the spoof film. But in this case, it's a spoof of the horror movie. But I'm not going to belabor the point too much. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. I hope it's giving you some incentive to see Buffy the Vampire Slayer for yourselves. And if you do, make sure you comment down below. Let me know what you thought. Did you enjoy it as much as I did? Was it as campy as I described? Was it maybe not as campy as I described? I wanted to give a discussion that incentivizes you to watch it, but also shares my thoughts on how much I enjoyed it. So, I do want to let you all know I will be live again this Saturday night at 8:30. We'll be doing another 90s retro discussion, and we'll be discussing Scream 2. Because these two movies, unbeknownst to me at the time, do link together rather nicely because they both star David Arquette in a role that started his career in a movie I think in a lot of ways heightened his career. So, but before I do close out, I do again want to say thank you all to all of you who caught this live, to all of you that will catch this on the replay. Make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the share. And if you come across this video and you enjoyed the discussion, hit the subscribe button because this is what I do here on the Ambassadorial Wing. I talk about the movies that we grew up on or those that may have passed underneath our radar at the time. As I said, I have missed you all. I'm glad to be back and plan on seeing a lot more of me. I do want to let you all know me and the missus, Madam Ambassador, will be doing a series of videos or anything coming up over the next few weeks. We're going to be discussing fantasy films from inside and outside of the Disney fantasy genre. So be sure to keep an eye out for those as well. And I'm playing out my content for the next several months, so I will plan on seeing you all then. But until we see each other again, as I like to say, be ambassadorial. Be honest. Be genuine. Be yourself. But never take yourself too seriously. If you do those things, there'll always be a place for you here in the Ambassadorial Wing. Until next time, see you then.
Let's be friends.
Have you not?